So let's talk about the insurance crisis that Louisiana is facing. Look, we have not been facing this just immediately. It's been going on for years. So back in 2020 and into 2021, this is when the crisis really started in Louisiana. It actually started back when major events such as Hurricane Laura, Hurricane Delta, and Hurricane Ida. So those are 2020 and 2021 events. What started happening during those? Obviously, a lot of claims started happening. But I even remember on the radio, for those of you who don't know, I'm on the home improvement show with WWL based out of New Orleans, where we take live answer and answer questions for the public for years, really into 2020, 2021, even 22, I was beating the drum saying, guys, go check your insurance policy with the rising cost of lumber and labor and all of those things. Go make sure you're properly insured, right? A lot of our policies were not properly correlating with the actual cost it would take to do repairs. Fast forward 2020, 2021, we start having these major events. During that time, and what we saw was that there were a lot of insurance companies that started going belly up. Don't quote me on this, but I remember it being like, I mean, five, six, seven, eight, maybe even nine properties. Don't quote me on that. That was one of the things I did not research, but I do remember it being multiple these insurance carriers that went belly up. Basically, they were not capitalized enough to handle all of those claims, much less the heightened cost that it took to rebuild during 2020 and 2021. Remember those times lumber was super expensive, things like that. So, with that being said, we saw these companies go belly up. So that started reducing, if they went belly up, a lot of times they've gone into receivership with the state. And so we then had less carriers. I remember previously, when I'd buy a project in Louisiana, South Louisiana, right? I'm based out of the New Orleans area. I'd buy a property and I'd call my insurance agent to get insurance. And a lot of times they would quote it previously and they'd have 30 different insurance carriers. But then 2020, 21, starting to go into this insurance crisis situation, it started happening that, in an ideal situation, there'd be three or four carriers that they could give me a quote from, or worst case scenario, no one would write a policy on it. And so therefore I had to go to the insurer of last resort. See, I didn't know about the insurer of last resort until this crisis started happening here in my state. So for all of you other folks who have never had this happen, I am talking about, in Louisiana, we call it Louisiana Citizens. Basically, the state has an insurance, basically, where they will insure as a last resort. I promise you, it is the worst quality of a policy that you can get. So you don't, it's of last resort. You don't want to just choose them. But people in California and in Florida, they have been witnessing this as well. Fun fact, I did not know that this existed again until this crisis happened. But this is a lesser quality of a policy. But again, it is being forced whenever you need insurance, but there's no carriers who are writing new policies for either your type of property or in your area or a mixture of those two metrics. And so it's important to understand that we had the carriers that went belly up. A lot went into the receivership of the state, and then there's basically less competition. So let me give you an example of me getting a policy with LA citizens, Louisiana citizens. So, for example, I bought a duplex in New Orleans East. Okay. So, New Orleans East, it's a duplex, $150,000 duplex. And it took four different policies simultaneously, having those four different policies to fully insure the property. So, normally we would get one to two policies, to insure property, the policy to cover the building, right? So because I'm not a homeowner, an investor, so like just call it a landlord policy. But then also, if it's in a flood, in a flood prone area, then I would also have flood insurance, right? So generally it's those two policies. Well, Louisiana Citizens, which is, the landlord policy part, did not include two things. It did not include liability. So in case someone fell, got hurt, and they wanted to sue, it also didn't include wind and hail, right? So if a wind event happens and blows the roof off, the siding off, it would not cover that. So we had to get separate policies for liability, and that sometimes it does not include fire, so you have to get a separate fire policy. So, guys, we had to get four policies for a $150,000 duplex, and guys, it ran us $8,500. Let me say that again, $8,500 for a $150,000 duplex in New Orleans East. So super important to understand what we're talking about here. It's basically these heightened premiums that really impacted, obviously, affordability and bottom line. So folks for years have been seeing major increases. So some of the things we've been seeing, right? The major increases at renewal. So let's just say your policy was, let's just say already high at 3,000, you get a renewal and boom, it jumps up to 8,500. And you're just like, what the heck, right? Major renewal increases. That is a major issue. Some of the things we also saw were carriers dropping us mid policy. So, for example, I bought a property in Lacombe, Louisiana, so on the North Shore, and I bought that property and had put a new policy on it, right? So, policy number one, when I bought it, that carrier dropped us. Basically, they were going insolvent, so we had to find new insurance within the first 30 days of owning that property. So then I had to go find a second policy, and we were at risk of that second policy dropping us as well. Thankfully, we were able to make it work. So dropping mid policy, so that was early on, but even, halfway through your policy, you could get noticed, because when we were learning of these different carriers going insolvent, that was when we saw some major, you were getting dropped and you just had to go find who would write you a policy. Another thing is we saw carriers. This is a thing that I started seeing into 2019, 2020. I think 2019 was the first time I saw this. I bought a property and I put insurance on it, and they contacted us and they said, we want to do an inspection of the exterior. I'm like, oh, okay. I never had that before. So they arranged where they did an exterior one. Into 20, I think it was 2021, I had where they called me. They said, we want to arrange. I remember I bought three houses on the same street in Covington, Louisiana. And so again, three houses, insured them all separately at the same time. And they did one exterior. One of them they didn't inspect at all, one exterior inspection, and then one interior inspection. So then we had to, coordinate with the tenant to get them inside. And when they're doing those inspections, if they find something that they don't like, they're like, hey, you have to fix this. They will send a demand letter. If you don't fix this, we will cancel you in the next 30 days. Literally, I remember one of those three houses, because they had tenants in them, they had a hose that was in the yard. So, elongated out in the yard, as well as like a kid's toy out in the front yard. And they sent photos of those. They said, if these are not picked up, these are a liability, like a tripping hazard. If these are not picked up and you show proof that they're no longer out in the yard, we will drop your policy in 30 days. I kid you not. That happened and it was freaking crazy. I was like, are you kidding? Okay, like let's go put it up, like easy fix. But another thing that we saw was plenty of times carriers were saying, hey, your roof is over 5 years old. We're not going to write you a policy, or our policy will be a lot more expensive if your roof is 5 years or older. So it started to become harder to sell a property if the roof was 5 years or older. And so there were some roofs I put on properties that were still good roofs, like no leaks, nothing like that. But because they were 8, 9, 10 years old, I had to replace them. When normally you should get 20 to 30 years useful life out of a roof. But here, especially during this crisis, we're being forced to replace a very expensive, part of a property. Some of the other things that happened, that's been happening during this insurance crisis. I don't want to speak about this in past tense because it's still happening. These things here. You're also, so if you've got a mortgage on your property, bank financing, things like that, you're required to keep insurance on the property. And the majority of the time, they do what's called an escrow. Basically, it's included in your escrow, right? So basically, the lender will pay for your insurance and your property taxes, and then every year, and they just basically charge you monthly. That's a part of your monthly payment, right? Is the escrow portion. Well, so they do what's called an escrow analysis. An escrow analysis is basically just double checking to make sure that there's no increases or decreases in your escrow portions. Again, insurance and property taxes. Well, because there's been such a rise in insurance, these escrow analysis, which usually only happen once or twice a year, when it came time for them to happen, so people would have, insurance renewal, and then they'd be like, my policy was so high, but oh man, my mortgage payment didn't go up this month. What a relief. But then 3 months later, the escrow analysis comes around. And what they didn't realize is that their escrow account was in the negative because of the major increase they had. And then boom, their policy, I'm sorry, because of those increases in the escrow, their monthly mortgage payment skyrocketed. For example, I bought a property where the monthly payment was $1,700. Currently, because of these increased prices, it immediately jumped to 2,300. It's at like 2,350 right now each month. Look at that difference. So that's literally a $650 increase, right? Within 2 years of having this property, it increased within the first 6 months, and it has stayed that way. I had another property that was in Lacombe, another Lacombe, Louisiana one, the one where they dropped we got dropped almost twice. That one, the payment was $1,100 a month. And if you follow me on social media, I actually documented this where I showed proof of my policy, not my policy, my mortgage statement of it going up. In a span of 2 years, my payment went up increasingly with these escrow analysis. It went from 1,100. Again, we had a 3 point, I think 875% loan. It went from 1,100 a month in 2021 to it jumped. I remember it was like 1,400, then 17, then 19, and then it ultimately was at $2,060 a month. 950 dollars a month increase, which is crazy, right? And so eventually, even with that low interest rate, I ended up selling that property in 2024. Even though I did a lot of things to try to combat that, it was very hard to do that. Um, Let me be very clear that your claim history does not matter. A lot of this a lot of this has to do with the region. My understanding is that there's different regions that insurance sees. Some are more prone to risk than others. And so understand that you could have done no claims, or it's been a long time since you've done a claim, and you will still be impacted by this. Okay. I am predominantly speaking about, by the way, the policy for wind and hail has been the biggest issue. Yes, we do have flood insurance issues, but the biggest issue has been wind and hail. So, Courtney, do we have any hope in sight? Let me give you some thoughts here. Um, there has been some stuff that the state of Louisiana has been doing. A while back, legislation did get passed to provide, I think it was $65 million to entice new carriers to come back in the state. Because there's such little competition, they can kind of charge what they can, right? Um, so millions was provided to entice insurance to either come back into the market, or for those who are currently here to open up their book of business to write more policies versus, nope, we're not writing any new policies in these areas, right? I'll be very honest. This is not something where a solution is going to come overnight. This is something where a solution will come in years, not in days. So keep that in mind. Um, One of the things that is important to understand is that in Louisiana, our legislative laws are problematic. Carriers um, take fault. Part of them don't want to do business in Louisiana because some of the laws that we have. This is where tort reform is really important. Um, Specifically, if you drive down our interstates in Louisiana, what do you see? Let me just say it's probably yellow and red billboards that say, it's literally attorney after attorney after attorney, where it's like, let's put, let's go after the big guy. Let's, sue, sue, sue. I mean, it is gross how many of those billboards are attorneys looking to earn your business, to sue anyone and everyone, right? So because we have a very litigious um, area where I honestly think we lead, if I'm not mistaken, I heard once, I think we lead the nation, if not, we're right up there at the top with our litigation, and which is causing for insurance. So a hurricane happens and people litigate, which I understand that there is a valid reason to litigate at times, right? You get an accident, people litigate, right? People sue against their insurance companies and things like definitely there are valid reasons to litigate, but at the same time, a lot of people rush to it as well. And there's also a lot of marketing to get new clients to then litigate. Those have not been welcoming to insurers, so we are having a hard time getting a lot of new carriers, and a lot of carriers equal more competition, which means they provide better prices to then get clients. Um, truly, it's really hard to. Let me go back to the litigation part. It's hard to fight against that because the lawyers lobby to get basically to protect their ability to have, in essence, a monopoly in that sense, right? It's really hard to combat that, right? Um, I will say this, it's important to understand, as I mentioned, location matters. So some areas are harder hit than others. For example, New Orleans East has had a harder time than other areas. Another one is St. Bernard Parish, and then another one from there is Slidell. Okay, so Slidell, New Orleans East, and the parish. There does not mean that there's not other areas suffering, but those are three hotbeds that I have seen where literally I have watched specific areas in those um, neighborhoods, markets, areas where literally neighborhoods are struggling. I mean, there's so much inventory for sale because people are struggling to be able to afford to buy in those areas. And especially areas that were otherwise previously, very attractive to buy in. Some areas that there are areas that are better. For example, River Ridge, Tangipahoa Parish, so it's like Hammond, Ponchatoula, right? And even in parts of Baton Rouge. So getting out of the southeast and start going up. Um, it's important to understand we're not the only state that is in a crisis. So Louisiana has been facing this for years. I believe that we were one of the first states, if not the first state, into this insurance crisis. But there is other states like Florida and um, California who have been, especially because they've had, obviously, guys, we have a lot of natural disasters. All three of our states do, between fires and then the hurricanes and such. Um, Similar issues have been happening. I will say this, you know, uh, there's some differences. Number one, we actually in Louisiana in 2024, we improved, we passed new building code to really try to improve our building standards. Basically, our building standards absolutely have to improve because basically we can become more storm hardy. Whenever a storm passes, there's so much massive damage on our building, our buildings, our properties, right? That we've got to be able to do more when it comes to how properties are being built or even renovated when they're being built and renovated to code, because that can kind of curtail some of the loss, right? Some of the damage. But places like California and Florida, they're facing a similar yet different battle. But here is the hard problem. First of all, we cannot compete population wise with California or Florida. We also cannot compete economically wise with California or Florida. And that right there makes us, our struggle is lasting longer. Yes, we are watching very closely, for example, what Florida is doing, what California is doing to basically improve their situation. And there's a lot that our legislators and our insurance commissioner is doing, modeled after, for example, Florida. But at the same time, I do think that we have a very unique challenge, which is overall our market is what it is. We have only so many basically clients we can entice these carriers with, and at the same time, the values of our properties are often limited. Think of the common value of a property in Louisiana versus California or Florida. So here are my concerns. Obviously, the litigious attorneys and that whole culture and atmosphere, again, very hard to fight that. Another one is, my concern is that this is going to cause people to flee South Louisiana, because basically the affordability, the squeeze is going to be so tight that we're going to have a negative population migration, right? Where people are leaving, there's more people leaving than people moving into the area. And that absolutely affects a lot of things. That affects things like local economic growth. There's less people shopping in the area, less people, maybe even less people who can work in an area, things like that. That impacts property values, that impacts a lot of things. Also, it's not good for people who are considering, for example, companies considering to move into the area. I mean, they look at those trends and they say, hey, that's not a good sign. Do we want to bring our business into that region? Same thing for people looking to move here. This is also causing investors and businesses to shut down because you've got investors who are owning properties who basically, they can no longer basically, they're losing money every month charging rent, but because insurance has gone so high, basically it is causing many investors that I know who are selling off their portfolios and going to a different state or getting out of owning properties in the first place, either by choice or kind of just, hey, we're just going to try to make a better financial move. There's other states, there's other areas where it's more enticing for my money. Same thing for businesses. Unfortunately, though, I've seen a lot of business go out of business in general because they cannot handle the pressures, but then some of them, again, are choosing to take their money elsewhere. I've been stopping foreclosures for the last decade. Absolutely, I am seeing foreclosures rise in our specific area versus nationally because of these rising costs. Now, let me make a caveat point here is that the very low interest rates, 30 something percent people have free and clear houses, okay? But that means, 60 to 70% of people have mortgages. The majority of them have mortgages under 4%. Okay, because of the really low interest rates we've had for so long, that I believe has been helping a lot of people kind of make do. When you have a lower interest rate, you have a lower payment, right? So people with lower interest rates, and thankfully because there's so many of them, they can handle basically for longer the higher insurance cost. But understand, people can only be squeezed for so long. But I do believe that that has actually been helping the situation. Um, Obviously, affordability is an issue across the board with inflation. People, there are layoffs happening. Whether a recession has been called or not, there's a lot of the feeling of being in a recession is happening on Main Street. So with your neighbors, your friends, and yourself, we're seeing, again, the cost of groceries going up, the cost of living, all of those things are going up, while at the same time, incomes are not meeting it. So affordability is continuing to be a major crisis issue. Another one, another concern I have is when people have free and clear property. So let's just say either you've paid off, you've worked really hard in home ownership and you've paid off your property. This is especially common from folks in retirement. But then what if you inherited a house from your parents? This is a family property. But at the same time, especially if you're on a fixed income and all of a sudden now your policy is jumping from a few, like say 3 grand to now it's eight, nine, and in some cases 10, 11, $12,000 a year, that is so impactful to someone's ability to make a financial decision of like, hey, having insurance then becomes a luxury. And so I know that there is folks who are choosing to self-insure out of default rather you know a, by a decision they want to make or for example can make to be able to self-insure, and therefore if they have a major issue they would have the money. A lot of people are not making that decision because they have the money. They're making that decision because they can't afford the policy. Here's where it further, that puts people at major risk. Here's where it makes me further concerned. For example, in the city of New Orleans, we have a lot of old housing stock that is built right on top of each other. My own house here in New Orleans, my neighbors, I could reach out if I wanted to and touch both properties, right? There's not a huge alleyway into either one. But the reality there is imagine if I inherited my house or I'm in retirement on a fixed income and I say, "Hey, I've got to make that hard decision. Let me call my insurance provider and say I need to cancel my insurance. I can no longer afford it." Well, then what if I have a fire? And because we're so close, that fire then impacts the neighboring properties, right? And usually, the policy of the issue, the starting issue can then spread into to help cover the other properties. But what if the property next door doesn't have insurance, right? Then we start having major issues, right? I think people self-insuring, especially by they're being forced to, it puts a lot of people at risk, and unfortunately, a lot of the marginalized. Um, Guys, this is something that I truly, truly am concerned about. Yes, we have a lot of, and as my friend Mike Fernandez says, he's down in St. Bernard. He says, look, I know the port issues, the train issues, stuff like that. Um, but guys, I want to just remind you, we have a lot of issues in our area. There's a lot of things you can be concerned about, but the most pressing issue truly is stuff like the insurance crisis going on. It affects everyone. If you don't own a property, but you rent, it is impacting you. If you have an employer who has, a physical building, they're having to have insurance on that. And that is impacting their ability to turn a profit for their business. Those things are huge. So I want you to stay tuned here because in my next video, because this one's getting long, in my next video, I want to explore some solutions for this crisis. But before I do, I just want to say this. The longer this crisis goes on, and I know this video has been very bleak describing the insurance crisis, but the longer that this crisis goes on, the more collateral damage there will be. And so it is critical that we are informed and we know our options and that we are taking action. And so please, my next video is going to describe some solutions. But guys, please inform yourself, learn your options, and learn how to take action yourself because this insurance crisis in Louisiana, it's not going away overnight. It did not come here overnight. It's not going away overnight. And people in our region need help. You may say, Courtney, I need help. I'm watching this because I'm trying to help myself and understand that this is the goal of me sharing this video is because I swear that I have this conversation all the time and I do not want to see the continued collateral damage, the folks that are getting hurt left and right because of this insurance crisis continue. And so I'm doing the best I can by continuing to educate folks because I want to see less people get hurt because of this.